Diaz, who is coming from the LA Mycological Society. So thank you so much for coming down here. Um, and he's a really fun guy.
Yeah. Yes, okay. Thank you. I mean, this is a mushroom fair. But I think when we have questions about mushrooms, these are extensions of questions about life, really. And the whole purpose for why I decided it was important to give this talk was there are fundamentally some unresolvable problems at the root of our understanding of life, but they're not immediately obvious. So what I'll do is walk through a number of imaginary situations, and hopefully it'll become clear. Just step into your imagination zone right now. So imagine that we come across an object in the world, and this object is thin and brittle. It could be anything, but let's pretend it's a mineral like this mica, okay? Perhaps we're in a destructive mood, and in our heads we form the intention of snapping it in half. So then we take it in our fingers and press our thumbs between, and it snaps in half. So this is the question, why did it break? So the obvious response is that it broke because we chose to break it. And maybe that's a satisfying enough answer to put the question to rest. But it's worth noting the structure of a satisfying enough answer, because what was implied is a sequence of events. We initiated a chain of actions, and the breaking of the mica was in effect. So that's to say we were the cause. So now imagine a similar scenario, but instead of mica, we have a piece of steel between our fingers, and we try to snap it, and we're not able to snap it as we expect. And what we've just demonstrated to ourselves is that it was not just our destructive intentions that caused the mica to break. It was that our fingers applied an external force greater than the internal force keeping the mica intact, and the effect of such an imbalance of forces in a brittle material is that the material should break. And what we've just done is atomize our imaginary situation into a sequence of physical interactions. And in this particular case, the initiating force is linked to our conscious intent, but we could easily imagine a situation out in the world where a boulder falls down a cliff and crashes into some mica down below, and the mica breaks. So that is to say, regardless of conscious external direction, some materials will break under stress. That is because we inhabit a physical universe that displays some consistent properties such that random physical interactions can display consistent tendencies. And so we could generally accept that there are some phenomena in the universe, earthquakes, lightning, minerals, that are just expressions of physical noise. So let's leave behind the mica and fix our curiosity on a different object, this mushroom. So you could probably form a question on any number of aspects about this little Lucaria, but let's go with something that seems to be of interest to a lot of people, definitely. Oops. Why is this mushroom red? So we accept that we have before us a physical phenomenon, and in the same way that the breaking of the mica is explained by an imbalance of forces, the observation of this mushroom being red is something that should fall within the realm of physical explanation. Maybe we could gain some insight by enlisting the help of a chemist, and this chemist could pulverize the mushroom, purify its contents, analyze the chemical composition, then identify the specific molecules that cause the mushroom to reflect particular wavelengths of light which the human nervous system detects and interprets as red. Then we're in a position to confidently make a statement like, this mushroom is red because such and such molecules cause the reflection of red light. But are we satisfied with that answer? Probably not, because that's not what we asked when we asked, why is this mushroom red? We didn't want to just know the immediate cause, we wanted to know the historical cause. And so in other words, the question, why is this the case, reflects the question, how did it become this way? And maybe you could already sense that we've started to approach the problem I alluded to at the beginning, But for now, let's leave aside the red mushroom and consider a similar question in a different scenario. So pretend you're encountering a knife for the first time, and you ask yourself, why is this object sharp? Then you observe the object as it exists in its natural environment, and you see that there are quite a number of them out in the world, and all of them possess some degree of sharpness. And most importantly, though, you see that these objects are being used by people in the action of cutting, and now you arrive at your answer. This object is sharp because it was made to fulfill the action of cutting. That is to say, the knife owes its sharpness to the fact of it being designed for a specific role in a specific project, and the implication here being that before there existed the knife, there existed the problem of cutting. So the conclusion that knives are for cutting is quite obvious and satisfactory, but only because we recognize ourselves as makers of artifacts, objects which owe themselves entirely to our own conscious, projective, and deliberate activities. And by definition, these objects are artificial, as opposed to natural objects like rocks and minerals, which result from undirected interactions of physical forces. There is no project being fulfilled in the formation of mountains. That is, if we accept the fundamental premise of modern science, that nature is objective and not projective, or acting with intent. But maybe you already feel that there's some difficulty with trying to rationalize the view that purposeful function is only an expression of human artifacts. Maybe you've already thought of an example that could pose a counterargument. There are many, but let's start with the one that's on the screen already, this bird's nest, which clearly appears to be designed by the bird for the purpose of sheltering its hatchlings. So the bird nest, by owing its existence to fulfilling a specific function through its specific structure, would seem to express very clear intention on behalf of the bird. But maybe we rationalize this back to the safety of scientific objectivity. Maybe the bird acts autonomously, responding only to instinct. And in that case, maybe the bird has no vision of what it's doing at all, and thereby is not acting with anything that we would call conscious intent. But let's look past the nest and turn our attention to the bird itself. The fact of it having built the nest is only a consequence of the bird possessing traits for grabbing, for seeing, for flying, for navigating, as well as all the proteins for converting chemical energy into heat energy, without which we wouldn't say the bird is doing much at all. So taking all these traits into consideration, let's just focus on a classic example, the eyeball. Which exhibits a structure so apparently well fit to the task of capturing images that our own best solutions for instruments that do the same thing, cameras, share a remarkable degree of similarity. The structure of an eyeball is so precisely organized that it's difficult to see how it could just be a random outcome of undirected physical interactions. Here's how we get to the important point, though. What is the difference between a camera and an eyeball? One way to answer this question would be to reflect on the objects as they appear in front of you and think about their direct origins. So the camera originated from the application of external forces to coerce inert matter into a desirable form, whereas the eyeball originated from internal forces which drove the spontaneous organization of dividing cells into ever more complex function-exhibiting structures. So trace backwards the life history of a camera as a function-exhibiting structure, and you get only as far back as the moment that its components were mined to make camera parts. But what about the eyeball? If you rewind all the cell divisions of embryogenesis, we end up with a sperm and an egg. And what are their origins? Actually, they are in fact extensions of other self-organizing function-exhibiting structures which possess eyeballs practically identical to the one in question. So if we keep going backwards in time like this, we'll see an unbroken lineage of function-exhibiting structure. Instead of an eyeball, now let's consider a bacterium, or any cell, really. And it becomes clear that a fundamental property of life is the maintenance of an identity through an internal drive to replicate. The Nobel Prize-winning biochemist Francois Jacob is quoted for an insight on this particular point, that the dream of every cell is to become two cells. So in the most basic sense, life consists of self-organizing structures which function in what appears to be the project of their own replication. As such, any appraisal of living systems is inextricable from the concepts of identity and lineage. The physical traits we observe in an organism, coloration, texture, body plan, odor, these are all expressions of common identity, but these physical traits are not themselves transmitted from generation to generation. Yes, we inherit eyes from our parents, but we started out our lives as a single cell in the womb with no eyes to be found. What is transmitted from parent to offspring is information. This is where we arrive at the fundamental commonality of all life on Earth, and that is DNA and the informational molecule and the code that it manifests in two pairs of nucleobases represented by 4 letters A, T, G, and C. And earlier we said that life exhibits a project of replicating an identity. And now looking at the most fundamental level, we can see that the physical structure of DNA, the twisted ladder, is itself the first manifestation of this project of invariant replication. So the ladder splits down the middle like a zipper, creating 2 separate strands, each containing the information to reproduce the other half with perfect fidelity. And this is because each nucleobase can only bond with another nucleobase of the same kind from which it was unzipped, A with T, G with C. These unpaired nucleobases then pair off again with nucleobases free-floating in the nucleus and the environment of the cell. And the project of invariant replication of an identity is fulfilled at its molecular level. So take note here that at the level of biological information, identity consists of a specific sequence rather than physical material. And this distinction is that of message and medium. The specific sequence later encodes a specific 3-dimensional protein structure, but 3-dimensional structures are not the substance of heredity. So the most important thing to consider here is that all of these steps of DNA replication are only accomplished through an external system of indescribably complex protein networks, which are the physical objects doing all of the unzipping and reassembling. So it's not that the DNA molecule itself is able to do all this stuff by itself. I mean, there are proteins that are coming in and physically intervening in its structure to fulfill the process of replication. But what this means really that the external DNA processing proteins are themselves the products of the DNA on which they're operating. So this is where we come down to the terror of biological self. It makes absolutely no sense. So furthermore, you need to realize that at the level of molecules, motion consists of random vibrations, which we call heat, essentially physical noise. So it must be the case that for biological molecules to maintain an invariant identity in any capacity, like a specific sequence of nucleobases, a living system must have the capacity to deal with random chance. The chaos of the intracellular environment and the rest of the external universe is the random chance that was present for life right from the very beginning. And it's not just benign noise either. Every day, the DNA in most of your cells experiences tens of thousands of events that can change or damage genetic sequence. These events are caused by external factors like radiation, but also internal stresses like cell processes. So consider the fact that all of our cells don't have cancer all the time, and it's immediately apparent how well equipped life is for handling constant DNA damage repair, because this is the only way it could have ever been. So reflect on the chaos of the universe, then consider the conditions of the primordial world from which emerged aperiodic structures with the capacity for replicative invariance. That is to say, invariant biological identity is only a consequence of mechanisms that keep it intact. So every cell in your body is an extension of a 3.8 billion-year-old project. But if this tendency for invariant replication is so essential to life, then how did we end up with this enormous diversity of forms and habits in organisms? Yeasts, lemurs, and oaks, and all these colorful mushrooms. Again, the answer relates to the primary requisite of life to deal with random chance. In short, it is the capacity for benign monsters or neutral variation. Most errors in DNA replication get corrected, but in some very rare instances, they slip undetected into the final code where they could be passed down to successive generations. This is how variation in DNA sequence is introduced, and is also an essentially random process. But rather than physical noise, aberrant gene sequence manifests something else, informational noise. Again, something inherent to living systems right from the very start. The sum of parts operates in a way that it can compensate for inconsistencies in its components. So in this way, the genome is a historical record of chance. Looking back on life, we see how feasibly it could have progressed through apparently minor disturbances in structures that already fulfill the basic maintenance and replication of identity under essentially unpredictable conditions. Yes, the conditions of the world can be predicted through parameter spaces that we invent, mathematical models for weather forecasts, the shapes of electron orbitals, but knowing exactly what the weather will be or knowing exactly the future position of an electron is something fundamentally inaccessible. Even a minor question like, will the sun rise tomorrow, turns out to be a black hole of circular reasoning. One interpretation is satisfied. There's no evidence from our experience to suggest that a model of the world where the sun rises every day is a false model. And since we cannot demonstrate that it is false, it must be true. But this conclusion relies entirely on faith that the future resembles the past. And could we ever be sure? You would have to pick a side with Popper or Hume. Regardless, that is to say, to say that the future is unknowable is not to say that empirical tendencies are useless. If I drop a rock from my hand, I could be quite sure that it won't turn into a flower before it hits the ground. Thinking back to the self-regulating apparatus of DNA and its protein machinery, the fact that it can compensate for internal and external disturbances implies what amounts to a memory of central tendencies. Yes, in some even more rare instances, random variation in the genetic code can impact a population such that their survival and reproduction is greater than it would have been if the genetic variant had not appeared. However, the arguments that I presented should make it fairly clear that the process of lucky accidents wouldn't be the primary driving force for the persistence of living systems. The primary driving force in the persistence of living system is the system itself. So if this is the case, why are there so many cases in which it appears that random genetic novelty has acted in the project of problem solving? Again, what happens is we imagine the lock before we encounter the key. Sorry, we imagine the lock because we encounter the key. The eye seems like a perfect solution to the problem of seeing, but only because the capacity to see became a necessary function for organisms that could see. There are plenty of organisms without eyes. Is this because they have not cracked the code to this particular problem of the universe? No, it's that evolutionary success is often conflated with moralistic projections about winners and losers. There is no revelation, only absolute creation. Some genetic novelties introduce new biochemical interactions, and if this novelty should be a fortuitous accident, new dependencies stack on top of each other, stack on top of ancient dependencies like layers in a house of cards, such that events out of the realm of pure chance become undeniable necessity. Here's a more tangible example, though. Imagine that after a landslide, a collection of boulders becomes a new feature of a landscape. The landscape also consists of small shrubs, which are used as shelter by a population of non-burrowing rodents. These rodents are the favorite meal of a predatory bird, and the cover of the shrubs has been historically necessary for their survival. Now imagine that during a wildfire, the rodents are able to take refuge amongst a boulder, boulders, but afterward, all the woody vegetation in the area has been incinerated. So having no immediate alternative, no immediate capacity to dig burrows, the rodents are forced to make use of the boulders indefinitely. So now this collection of rocks has been co-opted into the project of their survival. And it could be further imagined that as generations progress, the rodents become so specialized to this new habitat that they could no longer survive without it. They've given purpose to these rocks, which came into the world for no purpose at all. A bird today would probably not be able to survive in nature without its eyes, and these imaginary rodents without their rocks or their eyes. In either case was it preordained that birds or rodents should have either. So let's return to our red mushroom and re-examine the situation. Actually, this is not the only instance of a red mushroom. There are actually a number of mushrooms around this region that look just like this one. So the crucial point for making headway in our investigation is recognizing that in this case, physical similarity is a symptom of common ancestry. And now we're back to the concept of lineage, but as a population level process. So now that we look at it as a population level phenomenon, a more productive question to ask is why do I see this pattern? And so here's another scenario that could make this a bit more clear. Imagine a bag of marbles, which contains marbles of different colors. Each color is equally represented in this bag by the same number of marbles. Pretend that all the marbles are the same size, texture, other dimensions. You shake the bag, reach in blindly, and grab a handful of marbles, but you see that some colors are more represented in your hand than others. Why is this the case? It's because your hand can only hold so many marbles, and you are being random about which ones you take. So now imagine that you transfer the marbles in your hand into a new bag, and for each of these marbles in your hand, you add an additional marble of the same color, and repeat this process of randomly sampling marbles and transferring them to a new bag. And after a given number of iterations, you'll likely see that the proportion of marbles representing each color is far from the starting condition of each color being equally represented. You might even find that the bag now contains marbles of only a single color, for example, red. In this scenario with marbles, the reason why red becomes overrepresented in the population is not because being red makes the marble more likely to be grabbed. It is entirely an outcome of chance. Assuming that the marbles are practically identical in all other physical aspects, the fact of the marbles being different colors has no relevance in blind sampling. Color is a neutral factor. That is, for a trait to not be detrimental is not the equivalent of a trait being beneficial, or not good is not bad is not equal to good. Consider birthmarks. But on the other hand, consider a trait like perception of visual images, which exhibits immense and obvious utility in the life histories of such great number of animals that we could easily imagine a historical timeline starting from a unicellular ancestor in which the advantages conferred by novel capacity for simple light detection caused the overrepresentation of those associated qualities in the course of generations, progressing in a way that stacked complexity upon complexity like a house of cards, leading eventually to the present moment in which we observe that structures that we call eyes are well overrepresented across most of the animal kingdom, well, many branches of the animal kingdom. And this would be an acceptable scientific answer to the question, why do birds have eyes? But also to the question, how did eyes have birds? So notice what I've outlined here is a historical process. But the demon is that history cannot be rewound. Science attempts to remedy this through the experimental method. The experimental method works under the assumption that two groups can be identical enough in their predispositions such that when we intervene in the life history of one group, the difference between the two groups at the end can be attributed to our intervention and not to a difference in their predispositions. In medicine, an ideal experimental design could answer the question, why did group A become healthier than group B? With the response, because group A took our medicine, which caused them to feel better. So making this statement implies that groups A and B are so similar in their predispositions that they could represent alternative timelines for a singular event in the universe. To apply the experimental method to the question, why do birds have eyes, maybe you could take two birds, blindfold one of them, and observe that the blindfolded bird cannot navigate as it flies. But let's now phrase this answer in the language of cause and effect in the exact way that we set up the experiment. And this is what it sounds like. Birds have eyes because eyes cause them to be successful navigators. And okay, that's true, but bats are also successful navigators, and their success in navigation is not caused by their eyes, but their ears. So this must mean that not only do birds have eyes because eyes cause them to be successful navigators, but also that their navigational sense did not follow a different evolutionary trajectory. So we'll eventually find, as we dig deeper at this particular question, that to actually attribute historical cause would require us to be observers for two parallel timelines of evolutionary history. This can actually be reasonably approximated for microbial populations in laboratory conditions, and in some uncommon cases, the conditions of natural groups can be interpreted as natural experiments for much larger scales of evolution. But these are exceptions. For the most part, science makes do with the language of likelihood. But something else you may or may not have noticed is that I have deliberately avoided using the one word that's typically used to neatly sum up all these scenarios of biological refinement, and that is adaptation, which is probably the most misunderstood concept in all of biology and the greatest irritation for a cohesive theory of evolution. And earlier, we claimed in a very defensible way that life exhibits a project of invariant replication. But the trouble with adaptation starts with carving out the universe into problems and solutions. Yes, eyeballs are foreseeing. Eyeballs are foreseeing, yes. But saying that there is a function to a structure is not the same as saying there is a function to a historical process. The essential feature of history is random chance. Yes, perhaps it was the case that light perception caused the historical proliferation of organisms that could see, but again, it was not preordained that it should have been that way. And just as fundamental an issue as partitioning the world into problems and solutions is the issue with partitioning organisms into individual autonomous units that we call traits, because this is really just an extension of the problem with saying anything at all. Our experience of the world is filtered by our individual perceptions, which in turn inform our concepts, but it is also the case that concepts inform our perceptions, and this is the fiction of objectivity. Science accepts that concepts of the world are not the world themselves. Concepts are convenient fictions. Convenient because they demonstrate some degree of predictive utility. And the way science puts concepts on trial is through the process of scientific hypothesis testing. And this is how science has come to know the world generally, using our standing models to inform technology such that we could refine our perceptions in a way that we could better test our models for their predictive utility. And this is the circle of inference that has led to pretty much any technology that we have at this point. And in the language of statistics for hypothesis testing, if your model is the case, then observations should convincingly deviate from expectations if your model were not the case, which is the null and alternative hypothesis. But the most important part is that science only progresses through research aimed at falsification, contrasting our finite minds with the infinitude of the universe. It's a safe bet to humble yourself, really. So finally, let's wrap up the question of why this mushroom is red by first transforming the question into why have red mushrooms been overrepresented over the course of many successive generations of this population? Is it that the red color confers an advantage? It could be. But even if it were, consider that it may also be the case that the advantage is not specifically linked to the trait as we conceptualize it. We probably already assumed that the answer would not be, this mushroom is red, to cause humans to wonder about it. It's another example with this lichen. It used to be Caloplaca coralloides. Now it's Polycoleona coralloides. And it belongs to the order Teloscitales, and most of them are orange. And you could ask the question, why is this lichen orange? There's a lot of them in this particular group that are orange. And in this particular instance, the orange pigmentation is linked to sunscreen chemical. So it protects them from UV damage. So that could now allow us to form some very convincing scenario in evolutionary history where the fact that this particular pigment protects these lichens from UV damage caused the overrepresentation. So that is, the orange color is beneficial, but not because it appears orange to human eyes. But in the case of this Leucaria, it's not the case. It doesn't appear to be the case that these types of terrestrial mushrooms even need that degree of UV protection since their vegetative bodies are underground. But maybe red coloration to the mushroom is just a secondary consequence of a chemical advantage in another stage of this species' life history. Remember, though, what we saw with the bag of marbles, just how easily a single variant of a benign trait could be overrepresented in a population by pure chance. And why are we so confident that there would be so much benign variation out in nature? Because life, as a project of invariant replication, has only been possible through its property of maintaining metaphysical identity against the chaos of the universe. And every beat of your heart happens for the first time ever. Think about that and you'll agree. Now consider the life histories and behaviors of fungi and how most of them display a level of ecological and physiological flexibility that is unmatched in other eukaryotic organisms. Or at least it seems more the case that fungi are better equipped than most animals and plants to handle external and internal disruptions. So, I mean, in that way, there's comfort in fungi as a kingdom of cosmic jokes. So let's finish this presentation by revisiting the scenario that started it all. Remember, we took a piece of mica in our hands and broke it. And now there are no more, but yeah, we took a piece of mica in our hands, we broke it. But now there's no more distinction between this brittle material being crushed by our hand and our bad intentions, or being crushed by a falling rock. So the question, why did it break? In both cases, is being broken by our hands or being broken by a falling rock is an expression of physical noise, and that's really the answer to all of it, and that concludes. Thank you. Yeah, I'll let you marinate on that.
All right, thank you.
I wanted to ask about the color.
Yes.
You're talking about the color red and the specific wavelength of red. Recently, I was in Oaxaca, and that particular mushroom that you were showing, it was there everywhere.
Oh, yes.
And within the other type of mushrooms that they were showing, everyone kept thinking, why is that the only one with red? Can you elaborate more on the wavelength?
Oh, I mean, this is, so I mean, this last point that I was making is that, I mean, fungi as a group is, I mean, think about an animal. If we cut an animal in half, it's obviously going to die. If we have a block of mycelium, now we cut it in half, we have 2 blocks of mycelium. It's like, it's obviously going to do it. We're just so, I mean, fungi are just so, so resilient that it is conceivable that this red coloration could have no reason at all, because fungi, right from the very beginning, are so great at handling all of this random variation But it could have. So, but this is the point, though, is we don't know. I mean, no one has really investigated this particular question enough to know whether this red coloration is linked to a genetic benefit in some other aspect of the fungus's life history. No, it requires a specific investigation, and there's not a lot of money and interest in pointing these things out. But the point is, it feels very comfortable to tell yourself that it's like this for no reason at all. It's very freeing that way.
All right. Thanks again, Rudy.
Yeah, thank you. Hello.